Okay, so this talk is part of what will eventually become a larger project where I'm attempting to respond more generally to some of the critiques of phenomenology by contemporary speculative metaphysics, right, which is also sometimes referred to as speculative realism, speculative materialism, or just speculative philosophy. Right? But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on Quentin Meillassoux' book After Finitude from 2008. And first I want to explain briefly why I'm responding to this particular text. As probably a lot of you are aware of, there are certainly other contemporary philosophers who have leveled similar critiques against Husserl and against phenomenology in general, particularly the charge of anti-realism or idealism. And contemporary speculative realism generally has a pretty fraught relationship with phenomenology. But Meillassoux' work, particularly After Finitude, I think has had a particularly profound effect on the last decade of work in contemporary continental metaphysics. So it is certainly an important work that requires careful consideration. But I also find a lot of what he says to be worthwhile and challenging in the most important and exciting way, particularly some of what he says about the dangers of relativism, the tendency of relativistic thinking to foster or allow a space for sort of dangerous and violent extremist ideologies. So I think there's a lot there that might and should cause us to rethink some of the assumptions and implications of contemporary metaphysical positions. I just don't believe that it's particularly applicable to Husserlian phenomenology, particularly later work such as The Crisis and some related texts. So to give a sort of brief introduction into what Meillassoux is doing here, his work is a response to what he calls correlationism. And that's a label he applies to most of post-Kantian critical philosophy due to his core belief that due to the core belief of supposed correlationist philosophies that we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being and never to either term considered apart from the other. So as opposed to pre-Kantian dogmatic philosophy, which held that the world as it is represented to us, is defined by its resemblance or adequation to an in itself, which possesses at least some properties that adhere in it, regardless of whether it's given to an experiencing subject. Right? Correlationism holds that it's impossible to know the in itself, for as soon as we attempt to represent it to ourselves, it becomes the for us. Likewise, the notion of a subject that does not stand in some relation to a world is inconceivable within the framework of correlationism. And Meillassoux refers to Brentano's notion of intentional consciousness and the phrase that consciousness is always consciousness of something as one of his sort of stock examples of this type of thinking. So the relationship between subject and world, or more generally between thought and being, is more fundamental and is in fact constitutive of the two terms. And Meillassoux goes so far as to say that the entire effort of modern philosophy was to replace truth as adequation with truth considered as legality, Kant, or intersubjectivity, Husserl, or interpretation, hermeneutics. He refers to this as the principle of correlation, which is one of what he says are two main correlationist principles. The second, the principle of factiality, states simply that things could be otherwise than how they are, and in particular, that there could be an in itself which is radically different from the reality we know within the correlationist circle. For so-called weak correlationists like Kant, the thing itself is at least thinkable, if not knowable. Others, he says, who adhere to a stronger form of correlationism downplay the principle of factiality and take the stance that nothing outside the circle is even thinkable, let alone knowable. At the extreme, strong correlationism fades into what Meillassoux refers to as subjectivism, subjective idealism, a position he attributes to thinkers such as Nietzsche, Deleuze, and Bergson, among others. And he says that they take the correlation itself, in whatever form they conceive of it, as a metaphysical absolute which necessarily exists and could not be otherwise than it is. Whereas the weaker correlationists, they think that the correlation itself could be otherwise, and again, just don't want to, or think we can't speculate about what might be outside it, although we certainly can think about it. So in response to correlationism, Meillassoux proposes a return to metaphysics with a return to a type of metaphysics with some affinity to its pre-critical counterparts, namely one which preserves Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So for Meillassoux, the acceptance of the existence of primary qualities opens up what he calls the great outdoors, the absolute outside of pre-critical thinkers. And that gets opened up to contemporary philosophers who are willing to step outside the correlationist circle. And that stepping outside the circle, he says, basically implies, among other things, adopting the sort of speculative metaphysics that he outlines in After Finitude. And from the outset, Meillassoux identifies phenomenology as one of the central correlationist schools, stating that during the 20th century, the two principal media of the correlation were consciousness and language, the former bearing phenomenology, the latter the various currents of analytic philosophy. And some of you and some of my other colleagues who are analytic philosophers have been sort of baffled as to why Meillassoux is being talked about in their circles as well, and I think this type of critique is perhaps part of that reason. So the net of correlationism gets spread very widely, but of course here I'm focusing on aspects of his critique of phenomenology. So a general defense of phenomenology against the charges that Meillassoux levels could easily fill a book. So my goal here will just be limited to suggesting some ways in which Husserl's thought, particularly in The Crisis and other texts from that time period, ventures outside the correlationist circle. In fact, I contend that at that point, it seems that Husserl is even considering some of the same fundamental questions as Meillassoux and perhaps arriving at the same place in the end. So my analysis will proceed in 3 stages, addressing 3 moments of Meillassoux' critique that I believe lend themselves particularly well to a brief discussion in this context. And I'm leaving a lot out. Those of you who are familiar with the book will know that there's whole kind of aspects of it that I won't even be able to touch on here. Not because I don't think they're important, but just because I've only got a finite amount of time. So I will start by addressing this underlying assumption that correlationism in general, and thus Husserlian phenomenology in particular, is incompatible with metaphysical realism. And this is, of course, also a topic that could fill a book or many talks, and I'm glad to hear that actually some of our later talks today, I think, will be addressing this point from various angles in more depth than I will here. So then I'll transition into consideration of a particular instance where I do believe Husserl ventures into the great outdoors and explicitly addresses the relationship between phenomenology and a world devoid of consciousness, and thus devoid of givenness to consciousness. And then finally, I'll look briefly at a few of the statements Meillassoux makes about what he actually believes exists outside the circle, and whether this is truly incompatible with, at the very least, the direction that Husserl's thought is going in his late work. So the first point concerns, again, this question of whether phenomenology is indeed an anti-realist philosophy, and I'll get into this by talking about this notion of the ancestral statement, right? That's where Meillassoux begins his argument against correlationism. He talks about what he calls ancestral statements, which are statements about events anterior to the advent of life as well as consciousness. So that includes statements such as, our sun formed 4.6 billion years ago. Right? So such statements, he contends, pose a serious challenge to a correlationist understanding of reality, and particularly to any possible correlationist science. inasmuch as, for correlationists, any statement about the world can only have meaning for a thinking subject to whom that world is given. However, ancestral statements refer to a time prior to the emergence of life and consciousness, and thus prior to the very possibility of givenness to a subject. Such statements pose no problems for a pre-critical Cartesian thinker. She will just accept that the reference of these statements are real based on the empirical evidence for their previous existence, no matter how far in the past that existence was. A correlationist, however, doesn't have this luxury, since the statement's referent, existing chronologically prior to givenness, is literally unthinkable. How, then, could she possibly interpret the meaning of such a statement? So for Meillassoux, then, the correlationist is thus faced with a difficult situation. She presumably wants to avoid saying that the universe is only as old as humans or other sentient beings, but the ancestrality of statements such as our sun formed 4.6 billion years ago calls into question the foundational correlationist assumption that being and thought cannot exist independently, since clearly a world 4.6 billion years ago would have had to exist independently of any perceivers, right? And if people say that, well, there could have been perceivers in some distant galaxy, Meillassoux will just say, well, let's take it back to a split second before, after the Big Bang, a nanosecond after the Big Bang. There's going to be some time at which it was just impossible for there to have been perceivers, and that's what he's getting at. And with this ancestral statements and the ancestrality and the particular temporality, he says, that's associated with ancestrality. He says that the correlationist scientist, right, avoids having to deny the meaning or the literal truth of scientific claims, since, according to the correlationist, an ancestral statement is true insofar as it is founded upon an experiment that is in the present and that is also universalizable. So the ancestral event is not anterior to givenness, but rather it's something that gives itself in the present as anterior to givenness. Its truth is based on the reproducibility of experiments by present-day scientists and a consensus of contemporary scientific opinion on the significance of the experimental results, not on any sort of adequation of those results with any reference that existed in the distant past. Thus, while accepting the literal realist meaning of ancestral statements, the correlationist supposedly adds what she views as a deeper correlationist meaning to them, implicitly rephrasing the statement as event Y occurred X number of years before the emergence of humans for humans. Put more generally, being gives itself as anterior to givenness. And that's Meillassoux' formulation of what the correlationist is thinking when she does science or really does much of anything. So this, of course, for Meillassoux leads inevitably to a tension between an acknowledgement of the chronological anteriority of the event to the emergence of life and the logical priority of givenness over what is given, including the world in which the ancestral event took place. And this ultimately forces the correlationist to maintain that, quote, the ancestral statement is a true statement in that it is objective, but one whose referent cannot possibly have actually existed in the way this truth describes it. For Meillassoux, this bizarre position shows how the purportedly deeper correlationist meaning of the statement negates or cancels out its realist meaning, rendering it literally nonsensical. Correlationism is thus unable to comprehend the temporality of ancestral statements, their anteriority to thought and givenness, and unable to think the world in which ancestral events took place. So this has implications not only for philosophy, but also for scientific practice, inasmuch as, quote, once one has conceded that it makes no sense to claim that what is can be thought independently of the forms through which it is given to a thinking being, then it is no longer possible to accord to science that what it says is indeed the last word about what it says. And so that's by way of a general introduction to this notion of correlationism. Making the case then that Husserl doesn't fall into this trap of correlationism thus first requires a demonstration that his phenomenology is not incompatible with scientific realism. And like I said, I'm just going to touch on a few of the most salient passages, I think, in some of Husserl's central texts, and I look forward to hearing, again, more about this particular point in the papers that are going to come later today. So from there, I'll proceed to an examination of how Husserl deals with the question of ancestrality, as well as some related issues. I want to start then just briefly by talking about the A Bouquet and the phenomenological reduction, right? And of course, Husserl calls for the bracketing or suspending of judgment regarding the existence and nature of the external world, since the value of a phenomenological description is unrelated to whether or not the content of a perceptual act corresponds to an object in the outside world. And when Husserl introduces the A Bouquet in paragraphs 31 and 32 of Ideas 1, for example, he provides important clarification of what he is, and perhaps more importantly, isn't trying to accomplish with it. And while he acknowledges the similarities between the A Bouquet and Descartes' method of radical doubt, he adds that the latter should serve only as a methodological aid, particularly given how different his goals are from Descartes'. While Cartesian doubt entails attempting to negate the general thesis of the natural attitude, namely that the external world is indeed there, when we perform the A Bouquet, we do not give up the thesis, we alter nothing in our conviction that the spatio-temporal world exists. The thesis remains, but we suspend or make no use of it. Likewise, we also suspend the antithesis of the thesis, namely that the world does not exist. Instead of following Descartes' plan of systematic doubt, rejecting the thesis but embracing the antithesis, at least temporarily, we withhold judgment one way or the other. Husserl states explicitly that I do not negate this world, I do not doubt its existence. Indeed, he states that the natural world will ever after remain there as an actuality, in keeping with consciousness, even if it pleases us to bracket it. Likewise, in Analysis of Passive and Active Synthesis, he states that after performing the A Bouquet, we do not inquire into whether this tree, the tree that the perceiver naively sees, has a place in nature. It is a matter of indifference to us whether, in the realm of possible positings of the object to be grounded as legitimate, one of the positings comes about that accords or does not accord with our perception in its very sense content. And finally, in The Crisis, he states that through the radical A Bouquet, every interest in the actuality or non-actuality of the world is put out of play. While in the phenomenological attitude, then, right, we simply set aside the question of whether what we experience is an accurate representation of the external world. Right? Husserl reminds us repeatedly that the A Bouquet does not invalidate the methodology or the results of the empirical sciences. It simply makes absolutely no use of their valid results. But there's more to it than this. Husserl acknowledges that many of my conscious acts, while I'm in the natural attitude, concern precisely the question of whether my perceptions accurately represent the outside world. And indeed, the presupposition of the external world's existence underlies different aspects of Husserl's analysis, like, for example, the discussion of the doxic modalities or the characters of belief in ideas. These modalities, such as denial and affirmation, describe ways in which I judge the likelihood that my perceptual experiences accurately reflect the being of objects in the outside world. If, as Husserl says, every experience functions as consciousness of belief, it would seem that phenomenology at least assumes an implicit faith in the existence of the external world, regardless of our ability to know it. So I would say after this very brief summary here that there's certainly nothing intrinsic to the A Bouquet in itself that's incompatible with scientific realism. So this, of course, is not the extent of Meillassoux' critique of phenomenology. In fact, he considers it just a preliminary step, the explanation of an aporia that shows how problematic correlationist schools of thought are. So I'd like to now turn to one of the few instances where Meillassoux mentions Husserl by name in After Finitude. And while pretty scarce, these instances are telling, I think, because they really reveal how Meillassoux is reading Husserlian phenomenology, what he's seeing as somehow significant in it. And so one of these instances comes as he's discussing a possible counter-argument to his position, namely that he rejects correlationism because of the incorrect belief that it cannot account for the reality of unwitnessed events. Meillassoux' hypothetical opponent charges him with erroneously concluding that unwitnessed events are not thinkable within the correlationist circle. And the opponent then uses Husserl's notion of givenness by adumbrations or profiles, right, the Abschattung, as a counterexample. And this, of course, refers to the explanation of how I come to apprehend the unity of a given object of consciousness, despite the fact that, quote, the perspectival adumbration through which every spatial object invariably appears only manifests the spatial object from one side. As I move around the object and view it from different sides, my various perceptions are combined through what Husserl calls a kind of coinciding into a unity in consciousness. I thus recognize that these various profiles all belong to the same perceptual object, and I form expectations about what I'll experience in as yet unseen sides of the object, intentions which may or may not be fulfilled. In fact, for Husserl, every perception, quote, invokes an entire perceptual system. Every appearance that arises in it implies an entire system of appearance, specifically in the forms of intentional inner and outer horizons. We cannot even imagine a mode of appearance in which the appearing object would be given completely. On the basis of this, Meillassoux' hypothetical opponent makes the point that perception is essentially lacunary and concludes that phenomenologists have no problem accounting for unwitnessed events. The meaning of statements about the formation of our sun or an occurrence in an extremely distant galaxy comes through counterfactual statements such as, had there been a witness, then this occurrence would have been perceived in such and such a fashion. And this hypothetical opponent says this is analogous to the process by which I form expectations about what I would see if I were to walk around the other side of an object that is in front of me. So for Meillassoux, this rebuttal ultimately fails, since he says ancestrality is not, in fact, the temporal equivalent of spatial distance. And that in and of itself, I think, is a problematic statement that he makes, because he doesn't really give us any way to account in his metaphysics for how spatiality and temporality could be so radically different. He just kind of asserts it. But that's a topic for perhaps a different talk. But for here, right, the issue is that he tells us that insomuch as ancestral statements are, by definition, prior to givenness itself, ancestral reality does not refer to occurrences which a lacunary givenness cannot apprehend, but to occurrences which are not contemporaneous with any givenness, whether lacunary or not. So current, although extremely distant, perhaps unobserved, and maybe even unobservable events are posterior to the emergence of givenness itself. Thus, a phenomenological theory of perception can find a way to attribute meaning to them while still remaining within the correlationist circle. This can't possibly be the case with ancestral events, he says. And as a result, he contends the conception of a time before all life and consciousness has no place in a phenomenological worldview. As he puts it, the strong model of correlationism maintains not only that it is illegitimate to claim that we can know the in itself, but also that it is illegitimate to claim that we can at least think it. Any temporality that doesn't allow for the in itself to become the for me through the consideration of how it would have appeared if it had been witnessed is incomprehensible within a correlationist framework. So here, the significance of this notion of ancestrality, I think, starts to become clearer. He tells us at the beginning that, well, this is just his entree into the critique, but really ancestrality and its temporality keep coming up throughout the book, and it turns out to be right at the core of what he's saying. So he's kind of, I don't think he's telling us exactly how central it is at the beginning. But its significance becomes clear when he kind of reveals that his critique at a deeper level, right, is not about correlationism's inability to make sense of statements that refer to certain periods in the history of the universe, or even its faith in the existence of the world we inhabit today, but rather its inability to accommodate the world to which those statements refer, and again, the particular temporality that he attributes to it. So I'll say more about the specific attributes of this world and this temporality in the final section of this talk, but now I'd like to turn to an instance where I do believe that Husserl addresses this issue of a world not prior, but in this case posterior to all givenness. And this occurs in an unfinished text from 1934 entitled Foundational Investigations of the Phenomenological Origin of the Spatiality of Nature. The originary arc, the Earth, does not move. And this concerns our experience of the planet Earth as the fundamental ground of our experience. This text was actually originally entitled Overthrow of the Copernican Theory in Usual Interpretation of a Worldview. And that title was changed, at least by the time it was translated by, I don't think it was translated by Len Lawler, but it's in the Husserl at the Limits of Phenomenology volume as one of the supplemental texts after The Origin of Geometry with this sort of somewhat milder title. And it's obviously not one of Husserl's central texts, although there is some interesting, if sparse, scholarship about it. But I'm sort of going to focus on it here simply because Meillassoux decides to focus on it as somehow representational of Husserl's thought. Those of you who've read After Finitude know that he's not really given to quoting at length from the philosophers he's critiquing, but one of the perhaps longest quotes in the entire book comes in a footnote to one of the later chapters. And it is a footnote, again, where he quotes at length from this particular text from Husserl. And so I figure I'll sort of take him at his word that this text is central to our understanding of Husserl's phenomenology and kind of go into it in a bit more depth than he does. So he quotes, like I said, at length from the text, but only to point out a passage where Husserl alludes to the immortality of the ego. And here it really seems like he's trying to argue that Husserl is a subjectivist, not even just a strong correlationist. And I feel like he kind of also waffles about that throughout the book, exactly how strong he's considering Husserl's correlationism. And I'd actually kind of welcome a sort of a thorough exegesis on his part of exactly what he thinks Husserl is doing. But in this particular footnote, and I'll read that passage in a bit, he's saying that Husserl is eternalizing, immortalizing the ego, trying to make it into that sort of absolute correlationist principle. But I think that a more thorough examination of the context of this passage is going to reveal that a lot more than what can be gathered from this footnote. So Husserl starts with a simple observation that we experience the earth as a stable surface under our feet, one by which we orient ourselves in the world, and not as a body hurtling through space or as a celestial object like any other. Indeed, any specific representation of the world, whether Copernican, Ptolemaic, or anything else, is only possible on the basis of our having first conceived of the world as this fundamental ground. And this experience, of course, contradicts everything that contemporary astrophysics tells us about the structure of our solar system. But Husserl acknowledges that this foundational experience complicates our understanding of the sciences and brings to the forefront the very problem Meillassoux addresses, namely the seeming impossibility of conceiving of a world which exists in the absence of perceiving subjects. As Husserl puts it, with the problems now being considered, right, in that particular text, we confront properly the great problem of the legitimate sense of a universal, purely physical science of nature. Like Meillassoux, he's wondering here what a science that is devoid of the influence of human experience would look like, or even if it would be possible at all. he does recognize that scientific practice itself has not generally been troubled by this question, given the naive realist intuitions of most practicing scientists. In particular, he notes that in sciences like astrophysics that are concerned with, and here's a lengthy quote from the text, so in sciences that are concerned with, quote, the infinity of the totality of nature, the mode of observation in these sciences is usually the one in which carnal bodies are only accidentally particularized bodies, which can therefore also conceivably be completely ignored, so that a nature without organisms, without animals and humans is possible. It's almost necessary to believe, and occasionally even also seriously believe, that it is a mere factual occurrence, a state of affairs determined by the laws of nature that hold in the world, if animal flesh, psychical life, is causally connected to certain bodies or types of bodies of physical structure. Accordingly, it would be conceivable that these same carnal bodies, that precisely bodies of such a character, are just mere bodies. In other words, the natural sciences assume that the development of human consciousness and of life in general is a contingent fact. Thus, there's nothing special about human bodies that make them the necessary vehicles of conscious awareness, and also nothing intrinsic to the planet on which we happen to reside that would make it appropriate as a ground of human experience. From the perspective of the sciences, it's a celestial body like countless others. But the spatiality of nature, as understood phenomenologically, positions the Earth, so to speak, at the center of the universe, since it's our home in a way that no other object in space is. This causes Husserl to reflect on the way in which phenomenology seems to have taken astrophysics back to a time prior to the insights of the scientific revolution. He says, perhaps phenomenology has supported Copernican astrophysics, but also anti-Copernicanism, according to which God had fixed the Earth at a place in space. And in this particular statement, he really seems to anticipate the critique of correlationism that Meillassoux develops in chapter 5 of After Finitude, which he entitles Ptolemy's Revenge. From Kant onward, he says, philosophy has been problematizing the conditions under which modern science is thinkable, adding the supposedly deeper correlationist meaning to the literal meaning of scientific results, and in particular, opposing our perceptual experience of being situated on a stationary Earth to the insights of the Copernican revolution. And the starkness of this particular contrast of Ptolemaic versus Copernican worldviews makes it a particularly compelling example for Meillassoux, who states that the Copernico-Galilean decentering carried out by modern science gave rise to a Ptolemaic counter-revolution in philosophy. And now clearly no mainstream contemporary philosopher, correlationist or not, would literally want to deny the heliocentric nature of the solar system. And because of this, Meillassoux sees this as just one more shortcoming of phenomenology and the other schools he classifies under this rubric. Right, he's not ever claiming that correlationists actually want to adopt the geocentric model or that they believe that, the Earth was or the universe was created less than 13.7 billion years ago or anything like that. He goes to great pains to say he's not accusing them of believing these things, hence the contrast between what they believe about science and what their supposedly limiting correlationist philosophies are telling them must be the case and must be thinkable. What we see, what I see at least in this originary arc, the Foundational Investigations text from Husserl that Meillassoux makes such a big deal out of, at least is not, in fact, a placid, unthinking acceptance of the Ptolemaic implications of his position, but rather, I think he's wrestling here with exactly this troubling consequence of the phenomenological method, trying to make sense of how these two things can work together and not, in fact, saying that this is sort of a fatal shortcoming of phenomenology. Now, toward the end of the text, right, I think his hesitancy to accept this Ptolemaic understanding of the Earth's status, unquestioningly, as a deeper meaning of scientific statements about the planet becomes clear where he acknowledges that one may find it a little extravagant, frankly crazy, to contradict all natural scientific knowledge of actuality and real possibility. And to illustrate that point, right, he imagines a world after all life on Earth has been destroyed through perhaps a collision with another celestial body. And in such a world, he says, there would be no constituting subject and thus no constituted ground, right? No object that is, in fact, more than just a mere body, right? That becomes more than a mere body due to the way that it's experienced by thinking subjects. And, furthermore, there wouldn't even be any body with the potential to become such a ground. And he acknowledges the seeming unthinkability of this scenario. And this is the passage that Meillassoux quotes. He says, "What sense could the collapsing masses in space, in one space constructed a priori as absolutely homogeneous, have if the constituting life were eliminated? Indeed, does not that elimination itself have the sense, if it has any at all, of an elimination of and in the constituting subjectivity? The ego lives and precedes all actual and possible beings, and anything existent, whether in a real or irreal sense." So that last sentence is what he really focuses on, right? The ego lives and precedes all actual and possible beings, and anything existent, whether in a real or irreal sense. Right? So he describes this as, Meillassoux describes this as akin to the way the subjectivist thinkers eternalize and absolutize the correlation itself. Right? But as I've said, I don't believe that Husserl is doing this in a way that commits him to a Ptolemaic astronomy and a denial of the possibility of an ancestral temporality. And in order to illustrate why I believe this, I want to just step back for a second here and talk a little bit, by means of further contextualizing this text, talk a little bit about how Husserl conceived of the crisis and his sort of overall research project at this time. So Husserl acknowledges, right, that in the crisis, right, the rigor of the natural sciences, as well as the fact that the convincingness of their theoretical accomplishments and their enduringly compelling successes are unquestionable. He saw the work as a teleological historical reflection upon the origins of our critical scientific and philosophical situation, as well as an introduction to transcendental phenomenology. Right? More specifically, it's an inquiry into why there occurred an essential change, a positivistic restriction of the idea of science. Answering that question will, Husserl hopes, allow us to return to a broader understanding of the import of scientific practices and the resulting knowledge, which will in turn allow us to answer the question, what does science have to say about reason and unreason, or about us men as subjects of this freedom? And it's an inquiry that has the potential not only to alter scientific practice, but also perhaps to change the nature of consciousness more generally, since, as Husserl succinctly puts it, merely fact-minded sciences make merely fact-minded people. And so the crisis that he's investigating there is not one that calls the results of the sciences into question, but rather, he says, it shakes to the foundation the whole meaning of their truth, where the meaning that reason gives to the results of scientific inquiry is understood as their normative relatedness to truth in itself. So Husserl can inquire into the meaning of the scientific conception of the world without doubting the truth of scientific claims. And he expresses actually a similar sentiment in the author's preface to Ideas 1, where he states that our phenomenological idealism does not deny the positive existence of the real world and of nature, in the first place as though it held it to be an illusion. Its sole task and service is to clarify the meaning of this world, the precise sense in which everyone accepts it, and with undeniable right as actually existing. And of course, there was much about Husserl's thought that changed between Ideas and the crisis, but there's that one sentiment that persists, right? That the purpose of the inquiry is not to challenge our belief in the existence of the world, but to clarify the meaning of this world. Right? And as he states, now back in the Foundational Investigations, the originary ARC text, he says that one should not perpetrate the absurdity, indeed the absurdity, of presupposing tacitly beforehand the naturalistic or prevailing conception of the world, in order to consider then, in an anthropological and psychological way, the formation of science and of the interpretation of the world in human history. And here's where I think Meillassoux is just misinterpreting this text and these statements that Husserl's making here, because the reason why it would be absurd to do that is not because the naturalistic conception of the world is just to be outright rejected or seen as somehow derivative of this correlationist conception, but because the purpose of the inquiry is to discover why human science represents the world in the way it does, how it developed that representation, and how the particular nature of human experience and subjectivity has affected the development of scientific knowledge. So to assume at the outset of such an inquiry that the picture of the world given by the sciences is the way it is, simply because that's how the world is, would be to undermine the entire inquiry before it had even begun, since it would be an admission that the role of human consciousness in the process was essentially non-existent. So I think actually that we can, in a sense, agree with Meillassoux that a world devoid of consciousness and life would lack the meaning that phenomenological inquiry addresses, and perhaps it would lack some of the beings that phenomenology studies, since there would be no subjects in that world to have constituted that meaning, and in particular no critical and scientific philosophical situation to be in crisis. And in other words, and perhaps this is maybe just a bit of a crass way of putting it, there's a good reason why there's no section in the crisis, or for that matter, any other work in the philosophy or history of science that describes the scientific practices or the lived experiences of scientists 4.6 billion years ago. The crisis discusses how modern scientists think about past events, because that's what scientists do. Not because phenomenology doesn't allow for a world before human consciousness. So, I know I'm running short on time here, but to briefly kind of talk about this third point that I'd like to illustrate, right? Meillassoux goes on, right, later in the work to talk a little bit about what he thinks we actually find here in the great outdoors outside the correlationist circle, right? He claims to anticipate the kinds of arguments I've been giving, or at least some sort of very superficial version of them, and he says that, in fact, that he chose the term correlationism instead of idealism to describe schools such as phenomenology in order to stave off objections of the sort that phenomenology is not a dogmatic idealism, since intentionality is oriented toward a radical exteriority. Even though these positions claim that they are not subjective idealisms, they can't deny, on pain of self-refutation, that the exteriority which they elaborate is essentially relative to a consciousness, a language, or a Dasein. And so I think I've addressed some of that, but what I want to focus on here is the fact that he goes on then from that and explains that correlationism, as he defines it, is not, strictly speaking, an anti-realism, but really it's an anti-absolutism. Right? So correlation, he says, is the modern way of rejecting all possible knowledge of an absolute. It's the claim that we are locked up in our representations, conscious, linguistic, historical ones, without any sure means of access to an eternal reality independent of our specific point of view. And in the end, he concludes that there is only one absolute, one thing that is in fact necessary, and that is the contingency or facticity of all things in all states of affairs. If a world prior to consciousness is to be thinkable, he says that there must be some absolute that grounds the scientific truths of that world, and that science's truths can't be established by an intersubjective consensus among consciousness, as he says they are for phenomenology. So this absolute, right, is excuse me, what he calls the absence of, he formulates it as a principle of unreason. and says that the absence of reason is and can only be the ultimate property of the entity. Everything in every world is without reason and is thereby capable of actually becoming otherwise without reason. Right? So he says that basically one of the issues, one of the problems of the correlationist schools is their adherence to the principle of sufficient reason. And so we should toss that out and recognize that there is no ultimate reason or ground as to why things happen. And so to the correlationists' supposed agnosticism concerning the existence or nature of an in itself, outside the correlationist circle, right, he opposes the idea of a real knowledge of the in itself in the form solely of an absolute capacity to be other, with no cause and for no reason. Right, so he says that while the correlationist can conceive of her own annihilation, for example, as well as the annihilation of all living things, she only conceives of this as a possible future state and is not in a position to know anything about the nature of such a world, since it necessarily excludes consciousness. And he says that, right, this is fundamental to his thought, but I really can't, at the end of the day, know much at all about the great outdoors, only that it is a realm in which anything is possible and in which no absolute law exists, which necessitates any possible outcome. And just to give you one final quote from Meillassoux' text, he says, "Everything could actually collapse, from trees to stars, from stars to laws, from physical laws to logical laws, and this not by virtue of some superior law whereby everything is destined to perish, but by virtue of the absence of any superior law capable of preserving anything, no matter what, from perishing." All right, so I'll again wrap up here, and hopefully we can address some of this in the question and answer, but I want to leave with sort of my thoughts on this third point and why I'm sort of puzzled at where Meillassoux ends up, right? Because his sojourn into the great outdoors does not yield a vast amount of information, right? Only this one issue, right? This one point that he calls the principle of factiality, right? The facticity of all things and states of affairs. And I'm wondering whether this sort of extreme form of chaos, which he refers to as a hyper chaos, how different is, right, this claim that, right, there's this absolute that simply consists of this, the facticality of all things, right, but we can't know anything else about it. How different is this from where Husserl leaves us at the end of the originary arc text, where he is also looking into a world in which there is no consciousness, no life, no givenness at all, and saying, well, that anything could possibly, there could be anything there. And I don't think that simply saying that for Husserl, well, this is just a world that is somehow, I can only conceive of it as given to consciousness, is a sufficient answer, because that would certainly be at least the start of Meillassoux' answer, because I think that Husserl in these late texts is specifically addressing the same problem that Meillassoux is. And I don't see either one of them coming to be able to describe in any positive terms what we have in the great outdoors, whether there is giving us really any access to the in itself beyond simply saying, well, it could be anything. And Meillassoux wants to say that, well, it must be anything, but what does that mean? So since I know I'm just about done on time here, I'll stop there, and perhaps if any of you can enlighten me on the difference here and why this critique is so devastating, I would love to know.
Thank you very much. We have a question?
Thank you, Gina. You were incredibly clear on a text that is just very difficult to navigate, so I wanted to thank you for that.
Great, that's my first goal, is to just make what he's saying comprehensible. So.
Well, you did beautifully. My question is, where is, methodologically speaking, Meillassoux coming from? I mean, what kind of resources does he rely on as a philosopher to launch this critique itself? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's clearly relying on some form of rationality here and reason. Logic is high at work. All the claims that he's making about both this sort of reality that he's, negatively speaking, trying to point to, and the claims that he's making against phenomenology itself as a form of critique, so Kant and onward.
Right.
What are the resources that, I mean, one of the ways to challenge him is to say, look, Husserl was right about the immortality of the ego, quote unquote, insofar as look at what you're doing as a philosopher. I mean, where are you coming from? Whatever post-critical project it is that you're trying to engage in here is coming from a point of view, right? And so that's one of the ways to, I mean, just look at the method itself and sort of say, that would be one angle to look at this. And then the other question was, thinking about thinkability and conceivability as far as his own engagement with this very interesting notion, right? I mean, what kind of thinkability is that, and how does he get to it? What kind of conceivability is that, and how does he get to it?
Right. Those are great questions, and the first one is one that I will and am in the process of addressing in the sort of longer version of this, because you're absolutely right. What is his methodology? And one thing that he does, he at least thinks that he doesn't want to go back to some sort of dogmatic philosophy, but he wants to be able to he says, talk about the literal meaning of scientific claims, and therefore, for him, the way that we do that is by having some sort of structure in which we can mathematize them. And this is a huge aspect of After Finitude that I didn't even get to at all, right? His use of mathematics, and he talks about set theory and all kinds of stuff in an attempt to make his points. But at the end of the day, he wants to mathematize scientific claims, to give us a context for doing it. And he even admits, and this is something I had to skip here, that at the end of After Finitude, that this absolute that he has gotten to lies at the furthest remove from the absolutization we sought, the one that would allow mathematical science to describe the in itself. And so by the end of After Finitude, and even some other related texts that I've mixed in here, lectures and whatnot, the only thing he's managed to do is to say that, well, we can't have a logical contradiction because that would be a necessary being. And he has this whole argument for why that is. But so that's what he tells us about his sort of methodological biases, where he's coming from. And as with many things, I sort of wish he would flesh that out a bit more thoroughly, because he just kind of sort of tells us at the beginning of After Finitude, we're going to, adopt certain aspects of this pre-critical metaphysics. We're just assuming that the mathematization of nature is somehow this process, right? This work that will completely be able to allow us to not take phenomenological considerations into account, because somehow mathematics is not constructed by egos in any way. So that's kind of where he's coming from in a nutshell. And I'm sorry, your second question was
thinkability or conceivability that he's playing with here in his engagement with this notion or whatever it is.
right. Yeah, and that's
Of ancestral reality.
right, and that's problematic as well, because obviously he tells us over and over again that he wants. We need to have a science and a way of thinking about science that will allow us to, think these ancestral statements outside the correlationist circle. But, I could just as easily, and I think that's where you're going, right? You could make the argument, well, the minute he says that, he is indeed inside the correlationist circle, which simply shows how porous this circle is, right? Unlike perhaps the monad, it has lots of windows. You can easily, doors, you can get in and out, depending on what project you're engaging in.
Thank you. We have a second question here.
I think mine follows up on this closely, but I have a simpler, more practical question afterwards. Just to summarize, I think, as I understand it, you're saying, really, in this work, there's two presuppositions, right? First, how science investigates phenomena, and second, how one investigates science investigating phenomena. And it's pretty interesting, right, that it seems as if he misses both.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
He sort of conflates them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in other words, this idea that science, science only comes to know, right, an ancestral world through intentional, right, an investigation,
Right.
through science, right, as it turns
Exactly.
out. And he presupposes this, and then on top of this, he presupposes how he's watching science, right? So my question, what's interesting is Husserl later, not in that text, but in this around the same time, right, he comes to say things like nature is subsumed under spirit, things like this. We couldn't speak of nature without speaking of spirit. I mean, you would have to flesh this out maybe, but my question more, because you addressed a lot of this already, is practically, would it make more sense, I'll pronounce his name,
Meillassoux.
Meillassoux, I want to say Molyneux for some reason. Meillassoux, would it be practically better to engage, instead of saying you have Husserl wrong, to say you have, the point Husserl is making is for you to look at your own intentionality, and then you'll see what Husserl means more clearly? Would that be, I mean, I'm just asking practically to see how to engage these issues. These are
Right, yeah,
different instantiations of old issues, right? Scientism, naturalism.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, I think that's an excellent point and an excellent direction to take. And I think at the end of the day, since doing this project, I have done a lot of work on like phenomenological interpretations of like ancient philosophy. So the wonderful thing about this project is that Meillassoux is actually still alive. So, as you can literally tell him, like, you're getting this wrong, and I think you should do this. So that, I mean, I think absolutely that part of what I'd like to do is to be able to say, you're not only have you gotten Husserl wrong, but you need to perhaps engage in some phenomenological reflection and understand what it is that you are doing in this account. And, it's a problem I have with speculative realism in general, although I see a lot of value in it, but I also see kind of an unwillingness to engage with the phenomenological method, which of course I would say would be a precondition to actually critiquing it in a deep way. So absolutely, I think that would be a worthwhile endeavor.
And once again, Walter gets the last question.
Well, you know what? I saw Chad's hand up, and I had that opportunity last time. So, Chad, go ahead.
And he pointed at you, so the two of you need to get on the same page.
We're on. Go ahead.
So in the logical investigations, Husserl says explicitly that the realm of meaning is much wider than the realm of intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Meillassoux is pitching his arguments rests heavily on the idea of a perceiver of these things. Husserl is comfortable saying that we can think contradictory things in the logical investigations. So this is going back to the idea of what kind of modality is he resting on here when he says that it's impossible for us to imagine or conceive or think these things. When Husserl seems to be quite comfortable saying, well, there's a space of conceivability that is wider than the space of real possibility, and sometimes we have to rely on empirical science to help us figure out what's really possible and what's not. That is, what's authentically thinkable and what's only inauthentically thinkable. It just seems like he doesn't quite get that distinction, and that's a real error in his reading of Husserl. But I don't know, is that too simple? Is the correlationist circle still operative there, even in that claim?
Yeah, well, that's a great question as well. And I think, it's one of the things that I found so frustrating about the sort of the early chapters of the work, where he's outlining, it's been a long conference, outlining the correlationist circle, is that, he wants to be able to simply say, well, no, the minute you Joe or Jane phenomenologists make the statement that, X is conceivable or, X is thinkable, then you're sort of, by definition, within this circle, and whatever it is that's in your, in your conscious experience, or whatever you're thinking about, imagining, whatever you're doing, it's by definition simply for you, and therefore, you can't possibly think the in itself, which leads me to, again, ask him, well, why do you think you can think the in itself? Going back to the other comments, like somehow having, again, naive realist intuitions, or having this implicit faith in the mathematization of nature somehow gives you a pass that when you think things, it's not for you. So, yeah, I mean, I think certainly the logical investigations, I mean, those are things that I could certainly incorporate into the larger critique. What interested me here, what I wanted to focus on were these late texts, because Meillassoux just goes into so much detail on this relatively obscure text that I want to look at what Husserl is doing at that late moment. And, particularly because I think that there he really is starting to thematize exactly the issue instead of kind of unproblematically stating it like he does in the logical investigations. So that he's doing something, I think, akin to what Meillassoux is doing, but of course from a perspective that properly understands, obviously, phenomenology and values it. So that's hence the focus on the later texts.
I know a lot of us have much to thank Gina for over the past 3 days, not least of all this paper. Thank you so much.
Thanks.